September 1978. The Norwegian Sea, approximately 200 nautical miles north of the Arctic Circle. A joint NATO naval exercise brings together American, British, Norwegian, and other allied naval forces for operations simulating defense of Norway against potential Soviet aggression. The exercise provides training in coordinated operations, tests communication systems, validates tactical procedures, and inevitably attracts Soviet intelligence collection efforts. Soviet Northern Fleet routinely monitors NATO exercises, deploying surface ships and submarines to observe operations and collect intelligence on Western capabilities. Today, a Soviet Kiev-class destroyer maintains stations several miles from the main NATO formation, its radars and electronic surveillance systems recording emissions, its officers observing operations through binoculars and optical rangefinders. Captain Dmitry Ustinov stands on his destroyer's bridge-wing binoculars focused on HMS Invincible, a British light carrier displacing approximately 20 0 tons, commissioned just 2 years earlier as the first of a new class designed specifically to operate Sea Harrier VTOL aircraft. Ustinov has been observing Invincible's flight operations throughout the afternoon, documenting procedures and capabilities for his intelligence report. He's watched several Sea Harriers launch and recover, noting launch procedures that don't involve catapults and landing procedures that don't use arresting wires, capabilities that Soviet naval aviation doctrine considers impossible for fixed-wing jet aircraft. A Sea Harrier FRS-1 fighter reconnaissance Ost strike variant painted in Royal Navy gray-blue camouflage approaches Invincible from astern, flying at approximately 200 feet altitude above the gray North Atlantic waters. The pilot maintains 150 knots airspeed, radio communication with Invincible's air controllers, establishing clearance for landing. At approximately 1 mile from the ship, Ustinov watches through his binoculars as something extraordinary occurs. The Harrier's speed decreases noticeably, not the gradual deceleration of an aircraft reducing throttle, but rapid slowing that conventional aerodynamics can't explain. The aircraft seems to brake in midair, its forward motion arrested as if encountering invisible obstacle. What Ustinov observes is the pilot rotating the Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine's 4 vectoring nozzles from their cruise position, pointing rearward to provide forward thrust, toward vertical position, pointing downward. As the nozzles rotate, thrust that previously propelled the aircraft forward now supports it against gravity, and the rapid change in thrust vector causes the dramatic deceleration Ustinov witnesses. The Harrier continues slowing until forward motion stops completely. The aircraft hovers approximately 100 feet from Invincible's stern, its engine producing the 21,500 pounds of thrust necessary to support the aircraft's weight against gravity. The pilot makes fine adjustments to throttle and nozzle angle, maintaining stable hover despite wind gusts and the ship's motion through moderate seas. The Harrier begins descending vertically, the pilot reducing throttle slightly so thrust no longer equals aircraft weight, creating controlled descent at approximately 300 feet per minute. The aircraft settles toward Invincible's flight deck, a 60-foot wide surface that seems impossibly small compared to the 800-plus foot decks. Soviet doctrine teaches are minimum for fixed-wing jet operations. The Harrier touches down gently, its landing gear absorbing the vertical landing loads, occupying approximately 30 feet of deck space. Deck crews immediately approach to secure the aircraft and position it for the next launch cycle. The entire landing sequence from initial hover to wheels on deck takes less than 60 seconds. Ustinov lowers his binoculars and turns to his communications officer. Transmit to fleet headquarters. British have demonstrated vertical landing of jet fighter aircraft on carrier deck. No catapult, no arresting gear, no requirements for long runways we understand as necessary for jet operations. This capability changes calculations about what size ships can operate fixed-wing aircraft. Request technical intelligence assessment of implications for Soviet carrier doctrine. The report Ustinov submits after the exercise emphasizes the strategic and tactical implications. Soviet naval aviation operates from land bases or from Kiev-class aviation cruisers that carry helicopters only, the Ka-25 Hormone and later K-27 Helix for anti-submarine warfare. These helicopters provide useful capabilities for detecting and engaging submarines, but they can't perform fleet air defense, can't conduct strikes against surface targets at extended ranges, and can't match the speed, range, or payload of fixed-wing aircraft. The Kiev-class ships displace 40,000 tons, twice Invincible's displacement, but carry no fixed-wing aircraft because Soviet design bureaus haven't developed VTOL aircraft, matching Harrier's capabilities. The irony isn't lost on Soviet naval planners. British carriers half the size of Soviet aviation cruisers operate jet fighters that outperform anything Soviet helicopter carriers can deploy. To understand why Harrier represented such revolutionary capability and why Soviet forces struggled to match it, You need to understand both conventional carrier aviation requirements and the technical challenges VTOL flight presents. Conventional carrier aircraft require catapult systems to accelerate them from 0 to flying speed during takeoff, and they require arresting wire systems to decelerate them from flying speed to 0 during landing. These systems impose substantial requirements on carrier design. Catapults require steam or hydraulic systems generating enormous power, structural strength to handle launch forces, and deck space for the catapult tracks. Arresting wires require engineered systems that can absorb the kinetic energy of aircraft weighing 20 to 30 tons, landing at 150 plus knots, with machinery spaces below deck for the hydraulic damping systems. Most critically, conventional carrier operations require long flight decks, minimum 800 feet for safe operation, creating ship-size requirements that limit how many nations can build and operate carriers. Soviet naval doctrine through the 1970s accepted these limitations, concluding that aircraft carriers were too expensive and too vulnerable for Soviet Navy priorities. Instead, Soviet forces developed Kiev-class aviation cruisers, designed primarily for anti-submarine warfare, carrying helicopters that could detect and engage NATO submarines threatening Soviet ballistic missile submarines operating in protected bastions. The Kiev-class ships displaced 40,000 tons and featured extensive surface-to-air missile systems, cruise missiles for anti-ship missions, and facilities for 12-18 helicopters. But helicopters imposed their own limitations. The K-25 Hormone had range of approximately 400 kilometers, maximum speed of 120 km/s, and payload of 2 tons, sufficient for anti-submarine torpedoes, but inadequate for air defense or strike missions requiring longer range and heavier weapons. Western carriers operating conventional aircraft demonstrated capabilities Soviet helicopter carriers couldn't match. American and British carriers operated F-4 Phantom fighters capable of Mach 2+ speeds, 1,000+ mile ranges, and payloads exceeding 10 tons. These aircraft could establish combat air patrol protecting carrier battle groups from Soviet bombers and maritime patrol aircraft, could conduct strikes against shore targets or surface ships at extended ranges, and could engage Soviet aircraft attempting to locate Western carrier forces. The capability disparity was substantial, but Soviet leadership questioned whether the expense of building large conventional carriers justified the investment given Soviet strategic priorities, emphasizing submarine warfare and coastal defense. The Harrier changed this calculation by demonstrating that VTOL capability could enable fixed-wing operations from ships too small for conventional carrier aviation. The Hawker Siddeley Harrier originated with the P-1127 experimental aircraft developed between 1957 and 1960 to explore vectored thrust flight. The innovation centered on the Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine, a turbofan with 4 rotating nozzles that could direct thrust in any direction from straight down for vertical flight to straight back for conventional horizontal flight, and any angle between. During vertical flight, the nozzles pointed downward and engine thrust supported the aircraft's weight against gravity. During transition to horizontal flight, the pilot gradually rotated nozzles rearward, transitioning from thrust supporting weight to thrust propelling aircraft forward as wings generated lift. Development proceeded through the P-1127 prototype that first flew in 1960. The Kestrel evaluation aircraft tested in trinational trials involving United States, United Kingdom, and West Germany in 1965, and finally the Harrier GR, one that entered Royal Air Force service in 1969, the operational Harrier GR. One was powered by the Pegasus 11 engine producing 21,500 pounds of thrust, just sufficient to lift the aircraft as maximum takeoff weight of approximately 25,000 pounds. Maximum speed reached 650 meter burst, combat radius extended to 300 miles with typical weapons load, and payload capacity approached 5,000 pounds of external stores on underwing and fuselage hardpoints. The VTOL flight procedure required precise pilot technique. For vertical takeoff, the pilot rotated nozzles to 90 degrees, full down position, and advanced throttle to full power. The aircraft lifted vertically, climbing initially at several hundred feet per minute depending on fuel and weapons load. Once airborne and climbing, the pilot gradually rotated nozzles rearward, transitioning to conventional wing-borne flight as airspeed increased and wings generated sufficient lift. The transition was critical. Rotate too quickly and the aircraft would lose altitude. Rotate too slowly, and the aircraft would accelerate too fast for nozzle positions, creating unstable flight conditions. Landing reversed the sequence. Approach in conventional flight, decelerate while rotating nozzles toward vertical, establish hover, descend vertically using precise throttle control. The STOVL, short takeoff, vertical landing, technique provided tactical flexibility exceeding pure vertical operations. With partial fuel and weapons load, Harriers could take off from short runways measuring only 150 feet, using nozzles angled partially downward to provide extra lift during the takeoff roll. The short takeoff consumed less fuel than vertical takeoff and allowed heavier weapons loads, but still required minimal runway length compared to conventional aircraft needing 3,000 plus foot runways. The aircraft landed vertically regardless of takeoff method, eliminating landing distance requirements entirely. The Royal Navy Sea Harrier variant, developed specifically for naval operations, entered service in 1978. The navalized design incorporated Blue Fox radar for air-to-air and maritime surveillance missions, strengthened landing gear for shipboard operations, and corrosion-resistant materials for saltwater environment. The Sea Harrier carried AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles for air-to-air combat, plus bombs, rockets, or anti-ship missiles for strike missions. The aircraft operated from Invincible-class carriers, whose 600-foot flight decks were 200-plus feet shorter than conventional carriers required, demonstrating how VTOL capability enabled fixed-wing operations from ships that couldn't support conventional carrier aviation. Soviet attempts to develop comparable VTOL capability produced the Yak-38 Nordforger that entered service in 1976 aboard Kiev-class carriers. The Yak-38 used a different approach than Harrier. Rather than single vectoring thrust engine, Soviet designers used two dedicated lift engines mounted vertically behind the cockpit plus the main cruise engine with vectoring nozzle. The three-engine configuration created complexity and reliability problems. The lift engines operated only during vertical flight phases, meaning they added dead weight during cruise. The system required complex fuel management and engine coordination. Operational range was limited to approximately 200 miles. Payload capacity reached only 2 tons, and maintenance requirements were substantial. Soviet Navy deployed Yak-38s aboard Kiev-class carriers, but rarely used them operationally, preferring to rely on helicopters that, while less capable than fixed-wing aircraft, were at least reliable. The Falklands War, in April through June 1982, provided combat validation of Sea Harrier capabilities under demanding operational conditions. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982, Britain faced challenge of retaking islands located 8,000 miles from the United Kingdom, with no land bases available in the region. British conventional carriers had been retired, HMS Ark Royal decommissioned in 1979, leaving only the 2 Invincible-class light carriers equipped with Sea Harriers. HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes deployed to the South Atlantic, carrying approximately 20 Sea Harriers total, providing fixed-wing air capability that conventional military wisdom suggested was impossible from such small carriers. The Sea Harriers' combat performance exceeded even optimistic predictions. Operating from their small carriers in the stormy South Atlantic, Sea Harrier pilots flew combat air patrol protecting the task force from Argentine air attacks and conducted ground attack missions, supporting British ground forces after they landed. The air-to-air combat results were extraordinary. Sea Harriers achieved 20 confirmed kills against Argentine Mirage the 3 fighters, Skyhawk A4 attack aircraft, and other types, with 0 Sea Harriers lost in air-to-air combat. The 20-to-0 kill ratio reflected both superior pilot training and the tactical advantages VTOL capability provided. The VIFF technique, vectoring in forward flight, gave Harrier pilots unique capability in dogfights. By rotating the vectoring nozzles during combat maneuvering, pilots could instantly decelerate or change direction in ways conventional aircraft physics didn't allow. Argentine pilots attacking Harriers would find their targets suddenly slowing, causing the Argentine aircraft to overshoot, while the Harrier turned inside the Argentine fighter's turn radius and achieved firing position. The technique was demanding, requiring precise coordination of throttle, nozzle angle, and flight controls. But properly executed, it created tactical advantage no conventional fighter could counter. The deck operations advantages were equally important. Sea Harriers conducted vertical landings in rough seas that would have prevented conventional carrier operations, requiring calm conditions for safe arrested landings. The small carrier decks proved adequate because vertical landing required minimal space, and short takeoffs using ski jump ramps installed on carrier bows allowed heavily loaded aircraft to launch without catapults. Operations continued in weather conditions that grounded conventional aircraft, maintaining combat air patrol even during South Atlantic storms. Soviet naval observers monitored the Falklands campaign closely through intelligence collection, analyzing combat results and operational procedures that demonstrated capabilities Soviet helicopter carriers couldn't match. The realization was sobering. British carriers displacing 20,000 tons operating from the South Atlantic with no land-based air support had achieved air superiority over Argentine forces through fixed-wing VTOL aircraft, while Soviet 40,000-ton aviation cruisers operating helicopters only would have struggled to provide comparable capability. British small carriers had outperformed Soviet large helicopter carriers, validating VTOL technology that Soviet programs had failed to achieve. Soviet response included accelerating VTOL development programs, but the Yak-38 had already proven inadequate, and improved designs came too late. The Yak-141, developed in the late 1980s, incorporated supersonic capability and improved range compared to Yak-38, using advanced vectoring thrust similar to Harrier's approach rather than the troublesome lift engine configuration. But the Yak-141 program was cancelled in 1991 as the Soviet Union collapsed and defense budgets evaporated. Only 2 prototypes were built, and the aircraft never entered operational service. Soviet Navy never achieved effective VTOL fixed-wing capability, remaining dependent on helicopters for aviation support throughout the Cold War and beyond. The Harrier's operational success throughout the 1980s and beyond validated the VTOL concept comprehensively. The United States Marine Corps adopted the AV-8B Harrier II, an improved variant with greater range, payload, and avionics, beginning in 1985. Marine Harriers operated from amphibious assault ships and forward operating sites, providing close air support for ground forces in environments where conventional jets couldn't operate. Through conflicts in the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, and Iraq, Harriers demonstrated persistent capability to operate from small ships and austere bases, providing tactical flexibility conventional aircraft couldn't match. The F-35B Lightning II that entered service in 2015 represents modern VTOL technology building directly on Harrier's foundation. The F-35B uses advanced lift fan system providing vertical thrust capability while maintaining supersonic performance and stealth characteristics. United States Marine Corps and Royal Navy operate F-35Bs from amphibious ships and Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, continuing the VTOL tradition Harrier pioneered. The capability remains unique to Western forces. No other nations have achieved operational VTOL fighter capability despite decades of attempts. Soviet and Russian naval aviation took different paths after failing to match Harrier capabilities. The Admiral Kuznetsov carrier, commissioned in 1990, operates conventional Su-33 fighters using ski jump launches and arrested landings, requiring the long-deck conventional operations demand. Russia never achieved VTOL capability, and current Russian carrier programs remain focused on conventional designs. Chinese naval aviation similarly operates conventional carrier aircraft without VTOL capability, though China has shown interest in developing VTOL technology for future applications. When Captain Ustinov observed that Sea Harrier landing vertically on HMS Invincible in September 1978, he witnessed technology that challenged fundamental assumptions about carrier aviation. Soviet doctrine taught that fixed-wing jet operations required large carriers with catapults and arresting gear, that small ships could operate helicopters only, and that Western carrier aviation advantages reflected willingness to invest in expensive large carriers. Harrier demonstrated these assumptions were wrong. VTOL technology enabled jet fighter operations from ships displacing 20,000 tons, from damaged runways, from forward sites where conventional jets couldn't operate. The tactical flexibility VTOL provided gave Western naval forces capability. Soviet helicopter carriers couldn't match, and Soviet attempts to develop comparable technology consistently failed to produce aircraft, matching Harrier's combination of performance reliability and combat effectiveness proven during the Falklands War. Soviet helicopters lifted vertically. Harrier was jet fighter that did same and dominated skies.